How are we doing now? Oh, 37.
How many are you expecting?
Well, registrations were, well, I think there were some duplications in the registrations, but about 100.
Oh, really?
Yeah, 100 people, I think about 100 and odd people registered, yeah. So it's a mix of Ealing Matters members and people from our Facebook contacts, our Facebook page.
To be honest, I'm very new to all this because it's all, you know, we've got involved because of 2 dreadful planning applications on our doorsteps. And so we've, because I live in Acton Green in near South Acton Station.
Yeah.
And
to be honest, I think that's how most people get involved.
So I'm not very up on it all, but anyway, I have the question I've been asked to ask. So I ask the question, and and it'll be interesting to hear what. I have to say, it all does feel quite overwhelming. The kind of way buildings are just being driven through and neighbourhoods are changing, and we don't.
I think that's quite a common feeling.
Much say.
Yeah.
And what's really depressing is that people have said to me, "Oh, you know, there's no point in objecting because we don't get listened to anyway."
Yes.
Well, now today is an opportunity, if I can just jump in, to try to, you know, it's not just Peter Mason here, and I notice Councillor Munro has also joined. So there are people from the council, and it's our opportunity to talk to them, which is going to be an exciting thing.
Exactly.
This one. There's somebody called Corinna.
Yes.
I just registrations we've had now. We've had 149 registrations this evening.
Oh. We're up to 51 on the call, so.
Well, Eric has joined 3 times.
Corinne, hello.
Hello.
Lovely to see you. I saw your name on the registration.
Yeah. Hi, Kay. Hi, Kay.
Hi. Are you still in Bristol?
I am, but I'm coming back on Monday.
Oh, right. Oh, well, we'll have to get together.
We will. We will. Yeah. Give you a rejoining thing.
Could I just ask Will? I've only seen 25 people on the screen.
Somebody's
I'm seeing 25 people on the screen, but you're talking about 4.
Their machines, because it's very hard to hear anything at the moment. There's a lot of background noise.
Very first round of.
Can people please put mute on? Thank you.
Local plan.
You muted your have you muted your mic? Otherwise.
Down at the table now.
No.
Try that mute again. The other people
No, sit down there.
Hello, my name's Roger Green. I should be the only person you can hear right now. Is that correct? Good. Okay, so it's 7 o'clock. So welcome to the Ealing Matters public meeting about the new local plan. This is the first opportunity for the public to be involved in a discussion about the set of documents that will or should guide the future development of our borough. and replaces the previous document, which dates back to 2012. It's also the first meeting of this kind that we, or I suppose not many people, have organised before. So it could be a bit rough around the edges. I hope you'll be fine with that. We're pioneering a new form of local democracy here. So here to talk us through the plan development process and to answer some of the many questions gathered by Ealing Matters is Councillor Peter Mason. He's Ealing Council's Cabinet Member for Housing, Planning and Regeneration. We'll be starting with an introduction by Councillor Mason, where he'll explain what the local plan is about and the plan development process, which he's leading at the moment. And then Kay Garmison of Ealing Matters will present the results of a survey of the borough's residents, which have identified some concerns about planning generally around here. After that, there'll be 2 Q&A sessions, and how we run those I'll attempt to explain later on. So a couple of bits of housekeeping. One, we are recording the meeting. Yes, I remember to press record when we started. Thank you for the reminders, Kay. You may care to select gallery view to see all the people that are in the meeting, but be aware that you'll only see 25 of them at a time. The screens will only show 25 people. If you're going to ask a question later when you're called upon to do so, please unmute yourself. So take some time to familiarize yourself where the unmute button is on the device that you're using. So let's get started first, and I'm going to attempt to unmute speaker tonight, Councillor Mason. So I have to look through. Councillor Mason, I think you can unmute yourself. Could you try that, please? Great, excellent. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, Roger, and thank you everybody for joining this call. Just by way of introduction, as people know, I'm Peter. I'm the Cabinet Member for Housing, Planning and Transformation. The word transformation in this context doesn't actually refer to regeneration. That's part of the issue of how we kind of divide up roles. And so whilst I'm responsible for planning policy, I'm not responsible for some aspects of regeneration or for example, planning enforcement. They're roles that are shared by different members of the Cabinet. But I'm really happy to be here and to be able to contribute to the discussion, but most importantly, to be here to listen. This is an experiment that we're trying, and we've certainly had discussions about before. And I'm going to talk a little bit later on as well about some of the initiatives. Susan, I think you're not on mute. So
no, I'm just seeing myself and him. Okay.
Susan, I think you might be on. Your mic might be open. So
sorry.
Don't worry. So what I want to do kind of initially really is to talk a little bit about the overview of the local plan, what it is, what it seeks to do, then to unpack some of the challenges that are associated with it, but really then try and walk you through the principles and the values that the administration is trying to put in place in terms of how we are going through the process of the local plan. People on this call will know a little bit about town planning. You will know that in 1947, a groundbreaking piece of legislation handed powers to local authorities to be able to determine the types of development that should take place within communities and to restrain the ability of landowners to do effectively what it is that they wanted, the 1947 Town and Country Planning Act. And that's really the foundation of the planning system that we now exist within. And ultimately, a local plan is a piece of policy that allows us to monitor and to regulate the use of land. It's a policy through which we're able to implement certain bits of policies and objectives, whether that's house building or the provision of industrial land and land for commercial uses. But ultimately, it's a vision. It's a vision of the future of a borough, like Ealing, a vision that sets out how it ought to grow and to try and bring people to the table to achieve that objective. And we are in a situation where it hasn't always been the case. It certainly wasn't the case in the 50s and 60s. 90% of all house building is delivered by the private sector. It's actually even higher in London. And whilst we're trying to change that in terms of what we're doing at the council with our own house building company, we have to work with the private sector. We have to regulate the private sector to do the types of things that we want it to do. I'm seeing some of the questions come through, and I'm sure we can get into the detail. We exist within a framework. The local council is the third tier of a planning framework, where at the top sits the government's national planning policy framework. Underneath that is the London plan, and for us it's the local plan. And we have to conform to the policies that are above us, and we also have to work within the framework of the policies that are above us. So, for example, something like the presumption in favour of sustainable development that sits within the national planning policy framework is something that as a council we can't disagree with. We're not a city-state. As much as I'm sure many of the Labour group on the council would like to be a city-state and be able to determine our own policies, we don't have that ability. So we have to work within a framework. Now, and we also have to work with various other bits of legislation that determine our powers. For example, the housing delivery test, a piece of legislation that tells us that we have to not only plan for housing, but see housing delivered. And if we don't see housing delivered, then the very rules that we have to guide growth in a place like Ealing are taken away from us as we are instructed to make more land available or to remove bits of legislation. And we've seen, unfortunately, some of that happen. And the last couple of weeks, we've been talking a lot about changes to permitted development, the development that landowners are allowed to do without recourse to the planning system. Equally, there are going to be changes to class use orders that are going to have a serious impact on the way that our town centres can plan, contract or expand. And likewise, the government have made announcements about zone-based planning that they're looking to bring forward a white paper towards the end of the summer, which could have quite a significant impact in the way in which we as a local authority have power to regulate what happens to land in the borough. But a local plan exists in a context. It exists within a political context, an economic context, and a social context. A local plan can only do so much, and it is increasingly being asked to do even more things, like, for example, respond to the climate crisis, or to be able to deal with the levels of austerity that local authorities and public services have experienced, that then see local authorities do different things. And there's lots of literature on the notion of municipal entrepreneurialism, the idea that local authorities have had to take much more of a commercial approach to the way that they deliver public services if they're able to deal with the context in which they exist. And of course, what that means is so much of the legitimate political discourse and debate about really big, interesting topics are being displaced into a planning system that is not designed to be able to deal with them. We live in a globalized society, a globalized economy. We have limited powers to be able to constrain certain activities. And I'm sure we can get into some of that topic when we talk about house building. And a great example, and certainly it's a personal view, is the issue of value. Some of London's greatest successes in terms of its incredible jobs market also cause its worst failures and its worst inequalities. We have an overheated jobs market in London compared to the rest of the country that subsumes the country's appetite for infrastructure investment, whether that's HS2 or Crossrail. That infrastructure investment drives up land values and property prices, and that effectively has a significant impact on both housing demand and supply. And whilst we as a local authority do not control the jobs market in the way that we would want to, that agglomeration of value in London means that we end up displacing poverty to different parts of the country than we do redistributing wealth. Labour, and I will be political, in other parts of the country experiment with trying to retain value in cities. And some people might have heard of something called the Preston model, which tries to retain value created in local economies into communities that don't have investment from central government. In London, that's a different conversation because we actually generate so much value. And should the conversation that Ealing has be about an Ealing model or a London model that seeks to get value out of the city into other parts of the country. And I'm gonna wrap up. But herein lies the central issue and the central challenge of something like a local plan that's expected in kind of old terms to be able to try and generate an idea of a consensus. Because ultimately, so many people on this call, and I can see some of the names and faces, and some of you it's great to see, have disagreements, right? We have political disagreements, and we have disagreements about human nature. And if we can't agree on whether the state should be big or the state should be small, or whether the state should get out of people's way and not tax them or raise higher taxes, it's going to be really difficult for us to agree on some of the things that then come further down the line, like, for example, a vision for place, how tall buildings should be, what materials that they should be made of, how we prioritise various different things. I believe in the notion of an exercise that allows us to have those disagreements, but in a way that enables us to make compromises and to understand the framework in which we're operating and the levers that we can pull to prioritise and to deprioritise, but know that we can have a mature conversation about making that happen. And likewise, the debate that we have together in this group and with the public is also replicated within political parties. Political parties stand for election on manifestos. And we have our own internal dynamics and disagreements, even within the Labour Party. I'm sure that's not a surprise to anybody on this call. But we have a mechanism and a process through which we go through those disagreements and come forward with a collective idea or a collective understanding about what it is that we're trying to achieve. And that's something that I'm absolutely keen that we do with the community. And so as we get into this process of a local plan, we're going to be looking at how we open up and we transform the conversations that we have with residents. And that's something that we've started to do. So whether that has been through the improvements that we've made to our statement of community involvement, that detail what we expect of developers by way of transparency and engagement with communities and the information that they make available for individual planning applications, or whether that's, for example, opening up the local development advisory panel to talk about some of the big issues. And so far we've done that on housing. We did that last month around employment, and we held another of those yesterday to talk about design, to talk about massing, and to accept that there are going to be dissenting voices and to welcome those dissenting voices onto the table of experts to be viewed as an expert. And that's why I was really pleased that Stop the Towers were able to join New London Architecture, Allies and Morrison's, as well as architects, to be able to have that conversation. And likewise, as we go forward on things like conservation, super pleased that the council can plan to have a joint conference with Ealing Civic Society to talk about the proposed changes to conservation areas and to conservation management. Ultimately, this plan will be a collective exercise by the administration, but also in the conversations, in the early conversations that we have with each and every one of you and with communities, our 7 towns. And that process, as I say, has to be one in which we can have mature and open conversations and come to the types of compromises that we're going to need to make if we are going to be able to manage the growth of the borough, the eventual growth of the borough. And we can have a disagreement, I'm sure, about the concept of sustainable development, which I don't necessarily believe, but I'm sure we can get into that. But nevertheless, I'm willing to have an open and mature conversation where we can work through these discussions. And I know that's desperately what you want to. So enough from me. I'm here to listen, and I'm going to respond as best I can to the questions that you're going to give me. I might not be able to answer it all. I might not have the detail with me if you ask particularly detailed questions, but it's certainly a commitment to have that open dialogue that we want. So I'm going to stop there.
Peter, thank you. You finished right on time. I really appreciate that. Thank you. We're all quite new at doing this stuff. So next up is Kay Garmison of Ealing Matters to present some of the research that's recently been completed into what residents of the borough think. So Kay, I can't, I'm not now hosting, so I need Libby to unmute you, or you can unmute yourself.
Okay.
Yes, you're on.
Excellent. Okay. Okay. Well, I'd like to say, first of all, thank you, Peter, for engaging with us at this formative stage of the local plan. As I'm sure will become clear during the meeting, residents in Ealing are very fond of their borough and they want to stay in the way it changes. We see a session like this as a key input into the plan making exercise. This is the first meeting of its kind, but it's long overdue. Our current local plan was adopted in 2012, and government guidance requires regular reports called AMRs on its implementation. Ealing's last AMR covered 2013-14. Since that time, development across the borough has exploded, but requests for new AMRs have been ignored, sadly. The council has to date suppressed public debate on the development boom it's promoted, so we do welcome your offer to climb into the proverbial lion's den and engage with us now. I want to kick things off with a summary of residents' issues about how the last local plan has played out since it was adopted. I'll draw on examples to illustrate what's happened, but to everyone in the audience, as it's natural to draw on one's own experience, forgive me if I don't mention your particular area specifically. At the end of 2017, a group of us conducted a survey of residents' associations and community groups in the borough to find out which local issues concerned them most. We found several issues were having a major impact that people felt powerless to influence. We ended up forming Ealing Matters as a platform on which to raise them. Many of these issues are directly relevant to the local plan, so I want to revisit them now. They're overdevelopment, built heritage and local character, social infrastructure, and open space. Now, more than half the respondents in our survey mentioned overdevelopment. That's twice as many as any other issue. So we're going to split the presentation. I'll talk about overdevelopment first, and then we'll take your questions on that theme before moving on to the others. I hope everybody's happy with that. So moving on to overdevelopment. This came into sharp focus last year with the new London Architecture Survey, which monitors the number of buildings with 20 stories or more that are in the planning pipeline, i.e. have been announced or at a planning application stage or have been approved across London. So it covers the whole of London. We were shocked to find that the number of such buildings proposed for our leafy low-rise suburb had risen from 2 to 32 between 2013 and 2019. There was no mention of this in the core strategy section of the 2012 plan. Now, residents of North Acton and Southall are already very familiar with the result. And the Red Block Rebels brought these and other towers to life in their video, Ealing, the Sky's the Limit, which now more than 7,500 people have viewed. The Mayor of London places decision-making power with regard to tall buildings squarely with individual boroughs. And indeed, 7 boroughs have chosen not to permit them at all. Whereas here in Ealing, each tower sets a precedent for the next with no regard to context. That's how we've ended up with a residential tower rising to 55 stories in North Acton, which even the Mayor balks at. A coherent policy is needed. The NLA survey prompted us to start assembling a database of major new developments, which has expanded beyond tall towers to embrace major sites of 30 or more residential units across the borough. Now, we can't claim that it's exhaustive, and it measures planning applications rather than completions, which are the basis of the London Plan's housing targets. That said, we believe that our figures are, if anything, an underestimate. To put some numbers on it, on these major sites alone, more than 30,000 additional residential units have been completed since 2014, or are in the pipeline, most already with planning permission. The figure of 30,000 compares with Ealing's overall housing targets in the current and new London plans together of just over 28,000 units for the 15-year period from 2014-15 to 2028-29. In other words, we've already nominally reached our target for the next 10 years. Perhaps not all of these will be built out, but the new plan's focus must surely be to deliver these rather than continue to encourage ever more new schemes across the borough. Overdevelopment applies not only to the borough as a whole, but also to individual sites in which the maximum densities allowed by the current London plan are systematically exceeded. As an example, 48 development sites were designated in the 2012 plan, and each was accompanied by site-specific policies. In the race to cram as many units onto each site as possible, these local plan policies, whether they relate to height, aspect, context, etc., have been routinely ignored. In this context, the Manor Road and Hastings Road proposals in West Ealing spring to mind. Likewise, the concept described in the 2012 core strategy of a boulevard along the Uxbridge Road with an increase in the number of street trees has been scuppered by the approval of pavement edge developments such as Exchange Plaza on the opposite corner from the fire station and the 15 stories to be added to the front of the Premier Inn. If the local plan is to have any credibility, residents need the certainty that the policies within it will be adhered to. A final word about overdevelopment. We recognise the need to provide affordable housing and congratulate the Council on achieving its halfway target. However, the price of doing this has been far too high. The new plan must be clear. How much of the borough is to be concreted over? How much of the skyline blotted out in order to achieve this? I'll now hand you back to Roger to kick off the Q&A on overdevelopment.
Right, just to unmute myself. Right, thanks very much. Now, as Kay mentioned, there's going to be two sessions of questions, and the first one is about overdevelopment. So the way that we're going to try and run this as we pioneer this type of discussion is that I'll call upon people. I have a list of questions, and indeed, if anybody's got any questions that they haven't asked, please put them up on the as a chat message where Libby will be collating them. And once we've worked through the pre-submitted questions, we may have time for some of those. So when I call your name, please get ready to unmute yourself, and if there's any technical issues, I can read out the gist of what I believe you're going to ask. So first question for Peter on overdevelopment is from Rena Bimb. Rena, can you unmute yourself and ask the question, please?
Yep, can you hear me?
Yes, indeed.
All right, perfect. So my question is, for the borough of Ealing's most densely populated area, Southall has still been one of the most targeted areas for development in the borough and is clearly being subjected to overdevelopment. On the Ealing Council website, it states that 6,000 homes are being projected to be built in Southall over 20 years, following the Crossrail and the Mayor of London's 2014 Southall Opportunity Area Planning Framework. However, in the last 2 years, there have been over 10,000 new developments in the process of being built. An analysis of planning applications shows that more than 10,000 new homes have already either been built or are in the pipeline. Why was the local plan exceeded such a large extent in such a small area of time? Thank you, that's it.
Peter, Please unmute yourself.
So do you want me to take them in turn or in round?
Yes, I think so. Yeah, let's see how it goes like that. I think let's give it a go. See how it works.
So look, Rena, thank you for your question, and you're right to say that Southall has in place something called the Opportunity Area Framework that was put in place quite a significant number of years ago. That was really a response to the infrastructure investment I talked about in the introductions. The idea that because of the introduction of Crossrail, Southall, just as well as a significant number of other, if you like, locations along the Crossrail route, had the ability to take some housing growth. And the Southall Opportunity Area Framework, just like the others, was an attempt to effectively master plan or to give a greater sense of cohesion to the types of development that would that should or would go into that area. The challenge, just as it is with any sense of housing delivery, and picking up the issue of overdevelopment, which I'm sure will come, a local plan has the ability to set a framework in which you plan for growth. It doesn't have the ability to set a framework or to regulate what people actually deliver. So, for example, we know that, in terms of the numbers, and I'm sure we'll get to the annual monitoring report, we know roughly that there are 14,000 homes that the London Borough of Ealing has given planning permission to that haven't been built. And actually what we increasingly find, because of the nature in which development finance works, is that people will use the planning process as a mechanism to obtain higher land values by getting planning permission on sites and then selling them forward. So for example, the Southall Middlesex Business Centre, a big formerly industrial site within the Area Opportunity Framework, was brought forward under a big planning application by a private developer that went through a planning process that lasted a significant period of time. And after that planning application was agreed through the normal process, has put that piece of land on the open market. We don't have the ability as a council to prevent a private landowner doing that with a piece of land. We are duty bound to hear planning applications, and if we don't determine them within either specific timeframes or to a particular degree of quality, then the landowner has the ability to go through an exhaustive appeal process, one that residents don't have the opportunity to engage themselves if they disagree with the decision-making process. And so a local authority has to be able not just to plan for housing or to plan for housing they also have to be able to plan for reasonable expectation about what will be delivered. Now, clearly, Southall has undergone a significant amount of development pressure, just as it will continue to do, and just as other parts of the borough have too. And part of the conversation that we have to have about things like density and overdevelopment and numbers are as much influenced by the availability of land, about things like, for example, the green belt, the availability of brownfield land on which to build, as much as it does on value. So again, for example, the Middlesex Business Centre, that's being a piece of brownfield land that councils are often encouraged to be able to build on. So has Southall experienced significant housing pressure? Absolutely. Absolutely has expressed significant housing pressure. And other parts of the borough are likely to experience that type of pressure going forward. What the local plan will attempt to do is to be able to give that a better sense of a plan. And for those who were involved in the conversation that we had yesterday, that we published a characterization study that sought to try and understand in a much better way, in a much granular way, the things that make each of the 7 towns that make up the borough better. And the next phase of that process will be to produce design guides, a series of design guides for each of those 7 towns, to be able to better tell developers what is and what is not appropriate. And and the inappropriateness of some forms of tall buildings will absolutely be part of that guidance.
Thanks, Rena. Do you have any reaction to that you'd like to share, or shall we move on?
I think we can move on, but I do hear what has been said although I strongly disagree with it on the basis of infrastructure and other points, but I think other people are going to go into that later on in the meeting, so I'll let them do that. Thank you, though.
Thank you for being the first question. Thanks. Okay, so now Jean Fitzpatrick, are you available? Have you got your...
Yeah.
Yeah, great. Okay, let's go.
Well, Peter, it's really good to see you. And can I just quickly quote some words back to you? Values, vision, cohesion, what makes 7 towns feel better. My question is, who does Ealing Council envisage moving into all these high towers? And what kind of community or communities is Ealing Borough interested in creating and supporting? That does seem to escape me. Thank you.
Yeah, I think probably, Jean, probably some of the motivation, you can correct me in your question, probably is the phenomena that London sees, in which a significant number of the properties that get built by private developers end up being put on the market in places like Hong Kong and Indonesia and foreign countries, right? Would I be fair to say that that's probably part of it too?
That is part of it, but not entirely. So perhaps
sure.
Thank you.
So look, and I'm hoping to bring a guy called Bob Colnut, who some of you might have heard if you're involved in kind of the planning world, who's a guy that is very good and has methodically kind of ripped apart this notion of viability that sits in the kind of the financial calculations that sit at the heart of the planning framework that exist in that top tier, in that national planning policy framework. That effectively say to private developers who deliver the overwhelming majority of housing that they should be able to take a profit margin of anywhere between 20 to 22.5%, written into rule, right? It's probably the only example of a government that claims to be a free market government that uses the mechanism of the state to regulate profit for a private company. And that's the framework that we have to operate in when we consider planning applications. And sometimes it can be a zero-sum game between having an argument with a developer over affordable housing versus their contributions to design, their contributions to amenity, and I'm sure we can get into that because they have a fallback option of an appeal where we don't. And I know that we get criticised for talking about the fallback to appeal, but it's something that we have to consider. Look, part of this is about how the housing economy works. A developer who's building a large property building will invariably be building it on the basis of their access to debt as well as to capital. And when in an economy that doesn't manufacture anymore, not as we used to, where you can get a better return on your investment for investing money in something like property development, where average house prices in London go up, disproportionately higher than the profits that can be made by leaving money in banks, or for investing in things like stocks and shares, and particularly now, housing becomes a much more interesting prospect. And rather than kind of manufacturing goods to sale on the open market, what's increasingly happened, certainly in the last 20 years, is that properties have been manufactured to be sold on the international market, in which investors will effectively purchase them all up to then put into the private rented sector. And in a place like London, where we've got high degree of jobs growth, and where there's so much pressure on the housing market, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, because values will always go up, and there'll always be people who need to live somewhere, and they will increasingly pay higher degrees of rent that give people a better financial return. That's some of the stuff that's driving the housing economy. Now, as I say, we do not control the viability regime that sits within the National Planning Policy Framework. We have to plan for housing growth. And so the challenge that we have, and what we want to do through the local plan, is to think precisely about the questions that you're asking, Jean. If we're going to have housing growth in a borough like Ealing, where does it go? And what are the trade-offs and what are the requirements that we can put in place of developers in terms of the stuff that we get back, whether that's infrastructure, whether that's amenity, whether that's the style of buildings, whether that's the space within them, or whether that's our ability to lock into those legal agreements that we enter with them degrees of affordability, the targets that we call genuinely affordable housing. that, you know, that will be part of the conversation. And I think we're going to try and do that, certainly with Bob Colnut and others, probably towards the end of September. So I'm sure people might be interested in that conversation.
Okay, Jean, any follow-up points?
Yes, actually, 2 questions. Who are these developments for, and what kind of community does Ealing want to encourage to build in across our borough? Great explanation, economics, I understand probably most of it. Thank you, Peter. My questions, those 2 questions, have still not been answered. I want to know what is the vision for people in Ealing by Ealing Council. Thanks.
Yeah, well, the vision question is, Jean, and you know, as a Labour Party member, you'll have even greater access to that visioning process, because you know, we go through a process as a political party to come up with a vision that is our manifesto, that we stand on elections for, and, you know, and we will do the things that are in our election manifesto and that people can see, but it has to be a bigger conversation, right? We're not going to come up with a local plan that just says what we want it to say. It has to be a process that involves each and every one of you on the call. So it will be a discussion. It will be a discussion in communities and in forums like this, in which you have an opportunity to be able to define that for yourselves. I don't want to sit here as some sort of patrician politician telling communities what's good for them. That's not my style. What I want to do is to be able to create platforms in which you have them. Who will those developments be for? Well, those developments will be for the people who want to either buy them or they will want to rent them. We don't have the ability as a council. We cannot constrain the ability of a private developer or a purchaser to be able to buy property or to rent property in a place like Ealing. We have a housing target that we have to deliver. If we don't deliver a housing target, we have those powers taken away from us. We have the ability to control who gets access to genuinely affordable houses through housing associations or through people who are on the council's waiting list, who invariably have to be residents of the borough because that's just how it works. And we can control that. But what we can't control is the open market. We just simply don't have those powers. And if that means somebody from outside of the borough renting in a place like Southall, that will be what they do. And if that means somebody from Indonesia buying up a newly built £2 million flat at the top of the Dickens Yard development, again, you know, that is what will happen. We can't control that.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Next question, Mark Walker. Hello, Mark. Are you on your?
I am, Roger. Thanks.
Awesome. Yeah, off you go, please.
Thanks. Hi, Peter. Thanks for making the time.
Pleasure.
My little neighbourhood, Old Oak Lane, right at the north end of the borough, it's starting to see high-rise and very high-density developments being pushed through that we as residents feel undermine our area and the amenity. I'm not simply talking about houses being overlooked or anything like that. I mean a small neighbourhood's housing and flat numbers and the demand for local services being utterly transformed, you know, with knock-on effects for everyone. So my question is, what sort of protection might be afforded to old neighbourhoods like ours? You know, we're a Victorian bunch of cottages. What sort of protection will be afforded against such, you know, just completely transformational developments in a new local plan?
Yeah. So look, you know, I mean, the Old Oak's a fascinating area, right? Because you know, one of the great strengths of Old Oak and where it sits within London's economy is that it's one of, you know, it's the largest industrial estate in Europe. And whereas the old London plan had an expectation in it that we as a council would release industrial land for housing growth, the new London plan has an expectation that not only do we retain the industrial land that we have, but that we also increase it. Because actually our vision, you know, for London and for a place like Ealing isn't one in which we all just get onto trains in the morning and head into the central activity zone. We want to retain local employment, and local employment uses are purposeful and meaningful. And so in all the conversations that I'm aware of that have happened in a place like Old Oak, now our consistent position has been we don't want to see a loss of industrial land in a place like Old Oak. And you know, the Victorian cottages that existed and exist quite amazingly interspersed between what would have been old Victorian industry are some of its greatest strengths. And so, you know, one of the things that we have attempted to do through the conservation area reviews, and those documents are now available in draft format, is to be able to have a discussion about how we either extend boundaries or start looking to using Article 4 directions, mechanisms that enable us to have an even greater say over the types of development management that happen within those areas. The challenge to this, again, is the same one that I talk about in terms of infrastructure investment. The fact that HS2 is leaving London via West London and stopping at Old Oak Common means that there are billions of pounds going into building a station at that area. Whenever you put stations and whenever you put infrastructure investment, they will always become attractive to speculative land acquisition and people bringing forward development. And the higher that land value goes, invariably the bigger and chunkier and more heavy those developments then start to happen as they come forward. Now, Old Oak Common, has a scheme of powers and a local plan in place to be able to do that. And actually, the future of HS2 is going to have a really, really big impact on whether those plans even continue to remain viable or not. And, part of the challenge here is that the growth that you see in somewhere like North Acton is inconsiderable. Like in the grand scheme of what may end up happening in somewhere like Old Oak Common, Park Royal within the area, it will be a new Canary Wharf at some point. Those discussions were had, and that's going to be a major change. But where we can protect the conservation of what we have existing, and where we can protect all of those sensitive edges around the industry that's so interspersed with some of those cottages in East Acton, that's precisely what we're going to do. It's going to be a challenge, given some of the activity that's happening at Old Oak, but hopefully that gives you a greater sense as to how we're going to embed it.
Thanks, Mark. What did you think of Peter's reply there to your question?
I think, Peter, Old Oak's an oddity in a sense, because you've got High Speed 2 and the Development Corporation and all the rest of it. But my question was a bit more narrow in that, we've tried to get Ealing Council to reappraise our conservation area that we have for many years, and they just won't answer, full stop. But also that the high-rise developments are, very much part of Ealing's own remit. It's not just that land prices will go through the roof when High Speed 2 is completed. It's that our funny little enclaves of cottages could do with a little bit of protection. I see your sort of big picture thinking, but I'm thinking just a little bit more locally than you.
So do have a look, and I'm sure I can dig the link out and I can send it to you, but do have a look at the conservation area reviews that have now published. They're very much in draft format. They've not gone to kind of, if you like, statutory consultation first, because we made a commitment that we would make them public in order to have like an early conversation. And we want the local area, we want the conservation review areas to engage residents in conversation about whether they do what they need to do, and have conversations with your local councillors ahead of a statutory consultation that will then happen after the summer. Ealing Civic Society and us will do a joint conference in which we have a conversation about conservation and character. We can do that together, and I'm really pleased that we can do that together. We're going to bring in experts. We're going to have a conversation about design. So look at those boundaries. And again, the other thing, if we think that we need to apply an Article 4 direction that gives us a greater ability to kind of manage the process of change in those local areas, that's precisely what we will do. But, and I totally understand and appreciate that when a politician says, our vision is X, you will always take it with a pinch of salt. But, our vision for somewhere like Old Oak is not to lose that industrial land for persistent housing growth. It's to retain it, because actually we want people to be employed in the local area. And that might mean some intensification at the edges or even in the centre, probably more the centre. But we don't want to see a massive release of industrial land. And then on tall buildings, look, herein lies the problem. What the London plan in its new policy guidance pretty much says you have to, as a process of your local plan, consider where tall buildings can go. You don't have the ability in the new London plan to say that you can't have tall buildings. You have to be able to come up with an evidence base that demonstrates what's possible and what's not possible. Many years ago, we went through that kind of master planning exercise at North Acton to say that if there was one place in the London Borough of Ealing that could take a bit of tall buildings, was North Acton. and that's why there's a cluster of tall buildings in and around the North Acton station. Now, people are absolutely going to have disagreements whether that's been successful or not, and I certainly got the view, but it's North Acton or it's elsewhere. And as we go forward, that conversation has evolved to it's North Acton, Ealing Broadway, and around Southall Station, or it's somewhere else. And so again, we have to get into that conversation about, well, what compromises are we willing to make about where density and tall buildings go in a borough the size of Ealing with the housing pressures that it's got.
Right. Thanks. Okay, so I'm going to try something a bit different now. We've got two questions, Peter. Will be coming at you. I'm going to call Hilary Wise to speak first, then Roscoe White. And I see we've got 91 people in, which is great. And we've got till 8 o'clock to finish the discussion about overdevelopment. So Hilary, could you ask your question, please?
Hi, Peter. Yes. Can you hear me okay?
Go ahead.
Yeah. This is related to Jean's question in a way. The vast majority of housing coming through the planning process is 1 and 2 bed flats.
Yeah.
So I'm asking, how is this meeting the real need of Ealing people? I mean, housing people who are essential to the functioning of the borough, health, police, teaching, and so on, people often with families, and not just providing properties for speculative investment, which you did actually refer to.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
thanks.
I mean, oh, sorry, second question, sorry.
Yeah, second question, Roscoe White, unmute yourself, please. Calling Roscoe White.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
Go ahead, please.
Okay, all right. Just let me bring up my question here because I wrote it down. Well, I think the first thing is don't let the accent fool you. I've been a resident of Acton for well over 35 years, so I know what I'm talking about. What I'd like to know is Ealing is building a very large amount of dedicated student accommodation. It seems to me, or from my records, from what I've checked out, it seems to account for almost half the residential units planned for the general North Acton area. So I'd like to know why there is so much student accommodation being built and planned for if they don't pay any council tax and therefore there's no revenue. What is the benefit to the residents of Ealing? What are we getting out of it from creating so much housing specifically for students? Is it because they vote Labour and it keeps Julian Bell in power?
Right. Yeah. So, Peter, where are families going to live?
Yeah.
We only have small flats.
Like in direct answer to Roscoe's question, the reason that student accommodation is being built in a place like North Acton is because universities like Imperial are buying the land and coming forward with planning applications. And as a planning authority, we have to process those planning applications. We can't simply say to Imperial or to Unite Students or to any of the other landowners who buy those plots, no, sorry, you can't build student accommodation. We have to deal with every single planning application that crosses our desk, and we have to deal with it in the context of the local plan. We can't say in the local plan, you can't have this type of development. And in actual fact, if we go forward with the government's intention on zonal planning, actually that entire conversation flips on its head. It becomes much more like a borough-wide neighbourhood plan, which says this is the type of development that is acceptable. And if it forms this particular context, then it's allowed to go ahead without any sort of further recourse to a meaningful process of control, and that's permitted development. So why do developers bring forward applications? Because developers bring forward applications. We have the ability to negotiate with them on things like height, density, massing, affordable housing, amenity space, access to green space, the contributions that they make to employment, the contributions that they make to schools, the character of the buildings, the architecture of the buildings. What we don't have the ability to do is to prevent people from developing. On the issue of units and unit sizes, yeah, I mean, there's absolutely a proliferation of 1 and 2 bed units, not just in Ealing, but right across London. The core costs, the development economics that sit behind building buildings, right, the real cost is in the land and it's in the materials. And the distinction and the difference between a 2-bedroom flat or a 3-bedroom, 4-bedroom property are huge. One of the things that we're going to be doing in the coming weeks and months with the council's own house building company, Broadway Living, a company that strips out pretty much all developer profit and is able to deliver a house building program that is something like 96% genuinely affordable, not just government defined affordable, but genuinely affordable, is the design guide that sets the parameters of the type of building that we're going to bring forward. And you know, we're not going to be bringing forward 30-storey towers as a council, because actually, if we had our way in planning terms, purely in planning terms, actually we would be able to deliver dense buildings that take better characteristics and better format. And actually, we've got the ability as a local authority to bring together land in a way that developers can't when they just overbid each other to build stuff out. So you will see in our prioritisation exercise, when we bring forward development, the types of units that we do. There is a theory, look, there is a theory that says the quality of the private rented sector in different parts of the borough, where, you know, Victorian houses get chunked up into bedsits or into 1-bed properties where you get, you know, a small two up, two down in somewhere like Southall being brought forward to be cut into. Actually, if you build purpose-built 1- and 2-bedroom accommodation that's affordable, that's high quality, you prevent the kind of rapid decline of actually some of our best bits of heritage, our best bits of conservation, which are, you know, areas in the borough that are family-sized accommodation, family-sized units, and you displace some of that demand. And again, some of that information sits in some of the evidence bases that we generate to determine what housing need is and housing supply. But we're definitely going to have that conversation in the local plan when we come to those neighbourhood design guides. We're going to have that conversation when we have the design guide for Broadway Living, but we're also going to continue to keep on having it with developers in terms of the plans and proposals that they bring forward.
Okay, Hilary, Roscoe, any quick reaction to that?
Yeah, I've got a reaction. I don't buy any of that. I understand that big-scale developers representing the colleges and stuff may want to build towers at North Acton, but after 1 or maybe 2, the council has got the power to say, no more student accommodation. We've got enough, thank you very much. Refuse. I can guarantee you there'll be another 100 developers of towers wanting to rush in. We do not have to keep building student accommodation. I don't buy that. That's garbage. It's politically based, giving planning permission to student development. It's clear as a bell to the residents of Acton. We are not mugs.
And yeah, could I just add something?
Quickly, please.
Yeah. I mean, it does make it sound as though the outlook for families, people wanting to live in the borough as families, is pretty bleak. But it's going to be perhaps more of a bonanza for the Indonesian billionaires that Peter referred to.
Yeah, and you know, I'm not going to respond to Hilary because she's probably said what I would want to, but you know, Roscoe, I totally get your anger, right? I totally understand. The reality of the law and planning policy is that we do not have the ability simply to tell somebody no. If we were to tell somebody simply no, then they have the ability to go to appeal. And through that appeal process, they can look to the London Plan and they can look to the National Planning Policy Framework. And if we've simply crossed our arms and we've stamped our feet, you only have to look at some of the scandals that have happened just in the last few weeks about people like Richard Desmond, you know, whining and dining government ministers to get them to both call in and give permission to large-scale development, to know that, you know, the cards are not always in our hands and we have to deal with them as best we can. We can't simply say no.
Right. Okay.
It's never been tested, though, has it? I'm not aware of any refusals to build these towers, so it's not even been tested. We don't know what the planning inspectorate might, whose side they may come down on. 3 or 4 student towers already in existence at North Acton is enough. The planning inspector is bound to come down on residents' side. It's never even challenged. LBE just rolls over.
Take the Marshall building in Hanwell, you know, W7. Karen and I see on, you know, the Marshall building in Hanwell, 7 stories. Was it 7 or 9, Karen? I can't remember how tall it was. Was it 7 or 9? you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
9. It was 9 stories. Yeah. Council refused. Right, out of keeping with the local development. Black brick facades. You know, white tall buildings with kind of gold trim. You know, trying to emulate like a Marshall amplifier. You know, great in terms of the kind of the cultural heritage of Hanwell and its connection to Marshall amplification. But it was a crap development, and the council turned it down. What happened? Well, the planning inspector overturned the decision because it used the presumption in favour of sustainable development, and it, you know, in order to be able to justify the development. And of course, what happens when we turn applications down? Well, we have to defend them because that's the decision that the planning committee take, and you know, we're duty bound to, of course, legally defend the decisions that the planning committee make, and it costs us money, right? It costs us hundreds of thousands of pounds in legal fees and officer time, and the time that's spent by planning officers processing these applications, if we simply adopt a policy that says, compute says no. So, you know, that's the environment in which we're operating.
Right. Okay, let's move on to Claire Cole, please. Again, looking in more detail at some of the things which are being planned, the residential units. So Claire Cole, are you on mute?
Yes, I'm here.
Thank you.
Well, just to say where I live in Acton Green, so right at the kind of Chiswick, Acton, South Acton end of the borough. And our area is being threatened by planning applications that have gone in for some towers, like lots of other parts of the borough. But my question is about the quality of the units. So in the rush to deliver numbers of residential units, it's putting a strain on the quality of the accommodation that's being built in terms of room sizes, amenity space, and even access to light. And that's very true of some of the buildings that have been applied for recently around me. So it applies both to new builds, but also particularly to conversions and change of use properties. And so in the rush to meet housing targets, are we now building the slums of the future? Thank you.
Yeah, well, look, you know, one of the observations I make about house building in somewhere like London is, you know, when there was a point in time where there were slums in central London, and the solution to those slums was to invent the London suburbs of Barking and Dagenham and Redbridge, where huge estates of, you know, high quality, low rise homes were built on the outskirts of London in what effectively was metropolitan open land. Now, you know, the green belt is absolutely important to prevent urban sprawl, but of course what it does is it puts a green ring around London, and it forces development to have to be considered within it. And it means that you have to then have conversations about increasing density, and sometimes that then forces a conversation about increasing height. And, you know, there is a direct correlation between land values in somewhere like Acton Green, house prices, and average incomes. You know, in your neck of the woods, the average income in Southfields is £43,000 per person. In Southall Green, the area that I represent, it's 17,000. And so the discrepancy in terms of what people can afford determines what the land value is, and then it determines the degree of pressure that then gets put on to places like that. You know, design is key, right? There are standards that are set within the London plan about how big properties need to be. We've seen people attempt to experiment with different forms of accommodation. One of my big takeaways from COVID-19 has been the experience of people living in what they call co-living, somewhere like the Collective in Willesden Green, Willesden Junction. You know, a house solution that says that people could live in small bedrooms, you know, student accommodation, but have high quality, top quality social space. The idea being that that young people, millennials, live their lives outside of their properties in any circumstance, and they get onto tubes and they enjoy culture and heritage and arts, and they're with their friends, and they only ever really need a bolt hole. The same principle behind a studio. But if you've been a resident in one of those rooms and under lockdown for 4 months, unable to engage outside of those 4 walls, I suspect that that experience is absolutely terrible. And definitely, as a consequence of COVID, we're going to have some interesting conversations about what space standards in buildings should be. I'm super keen that we have that conversation in the context of design. Again, yesterday, a very interesting conversation about design and some early suggestions in terms of how we're going to do that, both by giving each neighbourhood that makes up the borough a better sense of what its character is and how that character should be managed and expressed in terms of the developments that come forward, but also improving the way that we bring in professionals via a standing Ealing design review panel, and also using community review panels in the way that the Old Oak Common have, to be able to be sounding boards of professionals and residents to kick the tires when those developments start to come through. Do they meet the community's aspiration? Do they meet what's in the local plan? Can we deliver them better and in more interesting ways? And how do we push the quality of space and design in the borough up?
Thank you. I see we're into injury time for the first half, but Claire, do you have a response or reaction to what Peter's just said?
Well, just quickly, I mean, look, I live in Acton Green, but actually the area I'm referring to is South Acton, and it used to be a really rough council estate with huge tower blocks, and it's been really nicely redeveloped into Acton Gardens.
Yeah.
And, you know, absurdly, we're now in a situation where people are applying to put, so Acton Gardens goes up to 12 stories. We've now got threats of 25-story towers building exactly what was demolished. And it's so sad because Acton Gardens is great. It's well designed, there's lots of amenities, there's lots of space around the buildings, and people are happy to living there. And I can't understand why we would want to kind of return to the forests of tower blocks that cause so many problems. And as my question said, you know, looking at the quality of the space within the build. So anyway,
it's a great example. You know, we spent so much time, energy, and effort working with residents to regenerate the South Acton estate, to kind of create master plans that then had, you know, consistent patterns of, you know, in some circumstances, yes, quite, you know, chunky buildings, 8 stories, 9 stories in some parts of the master plan, and higher in other parts too. But they benefited from the curve and a consistent plan. And then you get a developer coming forward, purchasing an option on a private piece of land, proposing initially a 25-story tower next to an 8-story building. Now, as I say, we have to have conversations with developers about what's appropriate and what's not appropriate. We don't have the ability to say simply no. And sometimes those conversations take place in the context of pre-planning conversations ahead of them submitting plans. But, you know, development like that is not acceptable, in my view, right? But it will be for the plan as presented, as compared to the local plan, as compared to the ability of the developer to appeal if they don't think they're going to get their way, that determines what the outcome should be. But, you know, be in no doubt. And, you know, and again, Stop the Towers picked up on the line that I've used in previous forums. Where a developer comes forward with a building that is too tall, that is too dense, and that does not fit the character of a local area, they will be told in no uncertain terms initially what the response is. What they decide to do with that information is then within their gift, and then it goes through a regulatory process. But, you know, do people bring forward ridiculous planning applications? Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Well, there are 2 more questions, so I'll keep the first half going for a bit longer, well into stoppage time. There are 2 questions, and so Henry Peterson, are you ready on your mute button?
Yes.
Able to speak? Please go ahead. Thank you.
I'll be quick because we are overrunning on time. You've referred on various occasions to design guides for neighbourhoods, town plans. In terms of master plans within the local plan, i.e. at a more detailed level, what is proposed? When you say the council is not able to refuse stuff and has few cards on the table, one of the basic reasons for that is you have one of the most out-of-date local plans in London. And you now have 5 years where developers have been able to go to appeal and argue that there are no policies which inhibit very tall buildings and so on and so forth that are up to date. So leaping into a new plan where you hope to be able to prescribe, use more detailed master plans, how is that going to work in practice?
Indeed, and so, and when will the new plan be in effect?
Yeah, well, you know, 2 things. You know, the local, you know, is having an out-of-date local plan not great. It's not great, right?
Yeah.
The general, and you know, right, conformity means that, you know, the moment that we write a plan and a plan gets approved through a very long process of being inspected and, you know, depending on what the regulatory environment that surrounds it happens, then it soon becomes quite out of date. And actually the expectation going forward is that you have a rolling and evolving process whereby you don't leave a local plan on a shelf for too long, even if its vision is for a 40-year growth cycle. So you have to keep on going back and revisiting. And you know, and when I took on the responsibility for the planning portfolio 2 years ago, you know, our manifesto made very, very clear that we would set to ensure that we delivered a new local plan within that time frame, within that window. Certainly, in terms of that master planning exercise, what I'm really keen to see is a better, if you like, spatial expression of those 7 town areas, both in terms of the characterization guides that we put in those plans that allow developers to understand the types of development that we would like to see, but for each of those 7 town areas, as I say, a better spatial expression about where we believe growth is appropriate and where we don't believe growth is appropriate, so that we can draw people's attention to bits of Ealing in which we can have a conversation, a mature and open conversation about where growth does go. And so, you know, we have to put together what's called a site allocations. That's just many of the site allocations that people actually, you know, play back to us when proposals come forward depart from their aspirations. But what we want to do, if you like, with those collections of site allocations is to put above them a master planning exercise. It might not be as in-depth or as coherent as what you get with very, very localized large-scale development, but nevertheless, a much better expressed expression of that collection of areas.
Right. Henry, any quick
well, we're very short of time, but it does seem to me it's 5 years too late, and you have a set of precedental, very tall buildings where it's going to be much harder to resist those being repeated than it would have been if you had a local plan 5 years ago.
Yeah, well, as I say, I've been doing this job for 2 years now. I'm committed to making sure that we've got an updated local plan. That's why I'm involved in this conversation. You know, we deal with the world as it is, not how we wish it to be. We're committed to making it happen, and that's what this conversation is about.
Right. So the local plan which you're leading the effort on, I think, Peter, when it's there, who's going to be kind of responsible for implementing it? Is it you as is it the chair of the planning committee or the officers? I mean, how will it be made to stick when it is done?
Yeah, well, it sticks in the context that it's the guiding document that planning officers have to use to be able to justify the decisions that they recommend to a planning committee when people bring forward new proposals. And it's the set of policies that our officers use to, if you like, police the planning enforcement issues where people haven't gone through the planning process. You know, if they've built things that they shouldn't have done, or if the consequences of their developments are not doing what they said they would when they went through that process. So it's a really vitally important document. But again, as I keep on stressing, you know, it's one document in a hierarchy of others. And the moment that we approve it, if somebody else above us comes in and says, well, you know, we're going to make, as they have done, you know, and people know this, if you make minor alterations to the London plan, or if you change what's in the National Planning Policy Framework, if you abandon the planning process as it is and opt instead for a zone-based planning system, then the local plan's, to some extent, not going to be worth the paper that it's written on, because those powers will be taken, and those decisions will be taken above us, and we will have to go through that exercise again.
Okay, so thank you. One last kick of the ball in the first half. Libby Kemp has the final question of the first half. Libby, you're hosting, so you should be able to unmute yourself without any difficulty. Libby, are you there? Wow, yeah. I thought we'd planned for everything. Right. Let's move on then. Kay, if you could. So second half now, Kay is going to be talking about some of the other issues in connection with local planning that she found in the survey that was done for Ealing Matters. So, Kay, are you ready with your screen share and unmute? It's the red thing with the. How's it going? Yes, yeah, can hear you.
Where am I there? So, moving on to the second session. While overdevelopment was the most common issue to emerge from the inaugural survey that created Ealing Matters, several others attracted considerable comment. So I'll deal with each of them briefly in turn. Ealing's built heritage, together with the conservation areas that are supposed to protect it, were felt to be core elements in creating the distinctive character of the borough, which has long rejoiced in the title Queen of the Suburbs. This was not only the view of our member groups, but also of many of the people who signed the petition to stop the 9-42 The Broadway development in Ealing Town Centre a few years ago. These included non-residents who compared Ealing favourably to other centres such as Croydon, Hounslow and Harrow, precisely because of its Victorian Edwardian architecture, its abundant green spaces and its human scale. In their design and access statements, developers praise our historic environment only to propose a scheme that will further damage it. The council seems oblivious to the harm they've done. The post of conservation officer has been abolished, and the planning committee has waved through the demolition of popular locally listed buildings such as the YMCA in Ealing Town Centre and the Art Deco Woolworths facade in West Ealing, true landmarks of our borough. And they give the go-ahead to developments such as the Wilton Towers behind the Hoover building that impinge horribly on their Grade 2 listed neighbour, or the Oaks in Acton at the gateway to a conservation area. An issue of similar importance to heritage in our survey is the neglect of essential social infrastructure. So many new homes are in the pipeline that Ealing's population looks set to grow by around 20% in the next 10 years. But most essential services like GP surgeries, schools, and open space for recreation can't keep pace. Beyond this though, too many key services, libraries, public halls, Ealing Hospital, are being drastically cut or totally shut down. Our town centres too have declined in quality and variety since the last plan was adopted. These factors can only lead to a serious decline in the quality of life across the borough, and the new plan must respond. I'm sure there'll be many questions on this theme, but I just want to pick up on two. The first concerns prospects for our town centres. I was astonished to hear the speaker on retail trends at the June LDPAC meeting forecast that retail floor space will grow when the evidence everywhere, not least the empty stores in Dickens Yard, points to it being in serious decline. So why are we planning mixed-use developments, for example, at Percival House? Secondly, too much promised social infrastructure is now dependent on commercial developers for whom it's not a priority. We've been promised for the last 3 years that the Filmworks cinema would open that year, but it's been continuously pushed back as the scheme has slowed. The same looks inevitable at Gurnell Leisure Centre should that scheme be approved. It applies too to community centres demolished to make way for development, but that are either shunted to a later phase or fail to materialise altogether. The final area I'd like to mention is open space. This has clearly risen up the agenda during the current health emergency, but the protections afforded to it are inadequate. Most prominent have been Warren Farm and now Gurnell, both metropolitan open land which in London has the same status as Greenbelt, but which the council has seen fit to try and use for other purposes. We've also had sight of a GLA document identifying 44 open spaces in the borough as possible sites for residential development. With the council having declared a climate change emergency and the awful experiences of COVID, our new local plan must put our open spaces at its very core. The temptation to keep chipping bits off it has to stop. Thank you. That was all I really wanted to say. So I'll hand you back to Roger again to take questions on this second set of topics.
Somebody got their iPad turned up to 11. It seems to have stopped. Thanks. Right, so we're about to start the second Q&A session, but I gather that I should have asked Libby to step forward with a question that had come from the through the chat channel. So, Libby, are you available to put that question to Peter? Please unmute yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Have you got? I think you might have two. Have you got two?
I'm good. Sorry, we've got very feedback. Leave me.
Yeah.
I'll come back later.
Okay. We'll leave you and we'll come back later. So let's go to the first question of the second section, and it's to do with the built heritage. Stuart Morley, are you standing by your mute button? Can you make yourself? Great. Good.
I don't know whether that's unmuted or not.
No, you're perfectly audible. Thank you. Please ask away.
Well, I appreciate that the question on built heritage and catchment conservation areas seems to be rather unimportant compared to the huge issues that have been discussed over the last hour. I really wanted to concentrate on central Ealing, which is covered with conservation areas, but we've got no conservation officer, and it doesn't seem to be anybody within the London Borough of Ealing who knows much about architecture or design, and decisions are made inconsistently between buildings. And I was hoping that Peter will be able to say that within the new local plan there'll be much more definitive policies rather than vague policies, so they can be interpreted by officers who perhaps haven't got the knowledge that a conservation officer would have, but has clear policies which they can apply and avoid some of the inconsistent decisions that have been made recently. That's the question.
Yeah, so look, one of the reasons I retrained as a town planner is that town planners are few and far between, right? And the nature of the market for town planners is such that significant numbers now work in private companies, right? And there's been a huge shift over the last, probably about the last 20 years, that now sees 60% of most graduate planners, where they would have all gone effectively to work for public bodies, now working in the private sector. So there's huge competition amongst local authorities to get good planners. And we have suffered, Ealing has suffered through not having a permanent complement of career grade, long-term appointees. Thankfully, that situation is now turned around. So where we had quite a lot of recourse to agency planners and people who would come in for short periods of time and then move on to the next assignment, we now have a significant number of career grade planners who work permanently for the council. And the reason that they are is because we're paying them more money, and we're paying them effectively a fee that they wouldn't get if they were working for a different local authority. And we actually have quite a good complement of people who come with not just their planning experience, but the nature of being a town planner in the 21st century is that you are expected to have additional qualifications in things like urban design or sustainability. And the expectation on a planner is that they have to have the ability to be able to be a generalist, yes, but also have kind of some degree of specialist knowledge or specialist understanding. Just as we do in other circumstances where we then require significant additional expertise or experience because of the state of the planning market, we tell developers that they've got to do it. So if a developer needs to appoint a conservation or needs to produce a report on conservation in order to justify the decisions that they're taking in relation to our planning policy, then that's what they have to do. as a council, the way that we're managing it, and I spoke about this previously, we are looking to improve the way in which we manage conservation, the way in which we manage design. And so whether that is a standing design review panel, whether that's standing community review panels that are made up of individual members, whether it's the design guidance that we're going to put in the context of the 7 town areas, those are improvements that we're going to make. And likewise, I really would encourage people to go and have a look at the conservation area reviews, in which there are some suggestions of some contractions of some conservation areas, particularly around the canal, because Canal and Riverside Trust have got a big agenda at the moment about reconnecting public open space, including green space, into communities. On the Cuckoo Estate in Hanwell, where there's been significant change, but in lots of other parts of the borough, and particularly in central Ealing, not only are we proposing the extension of conservation areas, but we're also proposing using Article 4 directions to give the council a greater degree of control over even some of the small and minor planning amendments that would otherwise be done with permitted development. So that's the direction of travel that we're going in. But I take a look at those documents and engage with the conservation area panels and engage with Civic Society for the conference that we're going to have coming up.
So Stuart, how did that sound to you?
Well, I have looked at the documents that you refer to, Peter. I looked at them yesterday, in fact, and I was encouraged by what you said, the extension of conservation areas covering bigger areas. That is a very positive signal. And what you said about employing people who have a better knowledge of design is also encouraging. But I think the policies in the plan need to reflect the fact that it isn't going to be always people who are very knowledgeable experts who will be interpreting policies, so that they could be more clearly spelt out and adhered to consistently. That's really my point. But it's very encouraging what you said so far.
Right, thank you. Okay, so next over to James Guest. James Guest, are you audible? James Guest.
Sorry, Roger. I think that James isn't actually on the meeting, so it's his question. This is Kay here, but I'm going to read it.
Yes, read away, thank you.
Okay. Well, we've talked about protections in conservation areas, but James wanted to know what protections there'll be for the majority of residents who live outside the conservation areas.
What protections against what?
Well, against unlikable development, destruction of the built heritage that we've got. It's not just in conservation areas, is what I'm saying. Yeah.
So, I get how this often feels, right? I get how it feels to be told, I'm sorry, we don't have the power, right? Permitted development rights. In the last 2 weeks, the government have announced a rapid change in permitted development, which allow in certain circumstances landowners to put an additional 2 stories on their buildings without so much as even needing to talk to the local authority, other than for fire, health and safety issues. So there are changes coming down the line on permitted development that are going to have a radical difference to small, well, not small, but substantial properties, as people exercise new rights to be able to make alterations to them. And as a local authority, we're not going to be able to do anything about them because we will not have those powers. Do we want those powers? Absolutely. Do we want the resources to be able to exercise those powers even more? But what the whole purpose, the principle that sits behind a local plan, and better spatial expression of neighbourhoods in terms of development and directing development in terms of where it should go, but equally a better understanding about what the character of a neighbourhood is and better design guidance to developers is effectively a process through which we tell them, if you do things this way, your life will be easier in the planning process. You will have less worries. Your planning application will go through quicker because you'll effectively be doing what we've asked you to do. And that's a different mechanism to get them to behave in a different way than just coming forward with madcap crazy schemes. And that's the kind of approach that we want to take going forward. the success of that will be, the proof of the pudding it will be in the eating, and that's probably not going to happen for quite some time. You either passively allow things to happen or you direct them and you guide them, and that can often be where people do feel that there's often conflicts between how we as custodians of place negotiate that on your behalf. And I'm sure that there'll be conflicts over that in the future, but that hopefully at least gives you a sense of at least the direction that we're going in.
Thanks. Libby, what would James say anything in particular about that, or should we move on?
I think we can move on.
Thank you. Well, the next question is from Libby Kemp. If we can hear her, Libby.
I think I'm working now.
Yeah, oh yes. Yeah, very good sound. Very good sound.
I'm going to ask a question, I think, from Janet Sachs, because she has asked a question and it's not turning up on the screen. And she said, what importance will cultural activities have in the plan for Ealing Town Centre?
I am actually here.
Oh, right, I can't see you.
I'll just thank you, Libby. Thank you. I just wanted to say that this really impacts on the quality of life that we have in the town centre, not just residential and retail, but how are you going to make life, what will the quality of life be in the town centre? How are you going to improve that at the moment?
Yeah. Okay, Roger, are you going to ask me at some point about retail and town centres? Because I don't want to spoil the answer.
No.
I'm not sure there's many questions about retail. Looking at the list, I think maybe people don't think there's going to be much retail in the future.
Yeah, well, they're right. So Kay, you were spot on in your analysis of the contribution that was made by some of our experts at the employment panel, which is this notion that actually we need to plan for the growth of retail in our town centres. Actually, if COVID's taught us anything, is that we are not moving about London in the way that we move about, right? And again, it comes back to this theory of this idea of agglomeration, which is what, unfortunately, in my view at least, destroys London, because it works on the principle that everything's got to go into one place and we all got to move to it. It's the same theory that says that we should have these great big giant shopping centres like Westfield that suck the life out of our high streets. People aren't going to Westfield; they're staying in their local parades and they're staying in their local areas to shop for day-to-day groceries. But actually, what we've seen destroy our high streets and send big retail companies into administration is internet shopping. And there's really an interesting conversation that we need to have as a borough in terms of that fulfilment. If that's the way the market's going to go, well, how do we consolidate? How do we consolidate people's internet shopping so that we don't have hundreds of thousands of lorries making movements and hundreds of thousands of white van movements in the borough at any one time? Can we think about how we do that in a better way? But it then also sponsors the question about, well, what is the future of a high street in the 21st century, right? The market as a concept was invented because ancient Greeks got together in the agora to discuss politics and the future of the city, and traders set themselves up in the archways of the agora to sell products rather than them being sold on farmsteads and trade happening in that way. The origins of a marketplace are not in buying and selling goods. The origins of a high street is in people coming together to do things. And so the future of high streets in the 21st century is probably far more rooted in cultural and conversational and in social forms of use than they are in retail uses. And we therefore have to have a collective conversation about whether we're willing to entertain a different and better use for high streets. And that might include that might have to include a difficult conversation about how high streets do contract. One of the things that happened in the 90s in terms of mixed use developments is everybody put ground floor uses of commercial properties, and go to parts of Acton in and around the industrial area to see some of those modern buildings built within the last 15 years. They've all got empty shops on the ground floor because somebody made an assumption at some point that they would be used by retail. They're not going to. So yes, we have to have a better conversation about what a town centre should be. I think it absolutely involves one about celebrating the culture that we have, whether that's the film heritage that we've got in Ealing, and actually in lots of different parts of the borough as well, whether that's celebrating and embedding our Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities in terms of places like Southall. That's the future, not flogging a dead horse of retail. It will be important to some extent, but we have to preempt the future and make it better, in my view.
I see the next question on the list that Kay was going to ask on behalf of Moira Lowe is to do with the retention of ground floors for commercial uses.
It's slightly different, actually, in the sense that you were talking, and I mentioned in the presentation, newly developed ground floors, which have never been filled from when they were first built. I think Moira's question is more about existing parades, smaller shopping areas like Pitsanger or Northfields, where the drive to residential has not gone unnoticed by the landlords who own those shops. And there's a bit of a push to convert those into, well, from what I've seen, pretty horrible residential. And Moira's question was about what can we do to protect those smaller locations, the smaller, potentially more interesting shops that exist within them.
Yeah. So, and again, there are things that we can do and there are things that we can't. So along with permitted development reforms that have been announced in the last few weeks, the government have also announced greater flexibility for use classes. At the moment, you have to go through a planning process if you have a shop, an A3 use, that you want to put into any different form of development. It doesn't work in other ways. You can put, an A1 into an A3, but you can't take an A3 out of an A3 shop, a retail shop, without planning permission. Now, that's all going to change under new permitted development rights. They're going to be much, much more flexible use classes. And what you've seen with permitted development rights is a significant number of buildings, not just predominantly in London, because that's where the value is, but old industrial buildings or old commercial office blocks exercising their right to use permitted development, again, completely bypasses us in terms of our ability to control it, to put those into residential uses. Now, in order for us to prevent that, we have to apply to government for dispensation, and they basically don't give it. They only give it to, if you like, the central activity zone, or where there is, key centres of things like, Canary Wharf. Canary Wharf has an exemption, for example, for key bits of it, because it's Canary Wharf, right? So we then have to think about how we use the plan in a different way and in a better way to express what a good town centre looks like. And, there are so many people I know on this call who are so invested in that topic. And I think there's plenty of learning that we can take from the exercises that you have done around what we tell developers we expect of them, even in terms of, the floor plates of the commercial units that come forward. If a developer builds a huge, giant floor plate that isn't going to get subdivided, that inherently has non-domestic business rates attached to it, and again, that's a mechanism, and that's a value that we don't control as a local authority. We can give discounts, but we want to use our ability to tell people what size units they do develop in new forms to kind of better protect the town centres that we've got. Sometimes that is going to have to involve a more sensible conversation about how we contract town centres, where we have, just a significant number of empty units. You don't have to go far from the town hall to know where some of those areas are.
Right. I see we've got about half a dozen questions to fit into the next 15-ish minutes, so we need to crack on. And Libby, you've got a question about with so much building and accommodation that to cover an area hasn't been talked about at all yet. So could you?
I think it's a question that I can ask. I can ask. It's not my question. It's one that's been sent in.
Yeah.
And I think I can ask it, but maybe it should be asked. Maybe Peter can reply later with some of our other questions that have come in.
Yeah, happy to.
And the question was from somebody in, I think, Acton. With so much new building and accompanying increase in population, services such as health and education are not keeping pace. How will the local plan ensure that this is taken into account when evaluating development and delivering them when developments reach completion. Now, at one of the GLA meetings, Jules Pike was really quite rude about councils allowing developments to go ahead and not completing the services that they need to go with them. He was really quite hot on that. And we have some here. I mean, I think North Acton is a really good case in point, where there are no doctor surgeries. There's one that's has got 6,000 people registered.
Hang on, Libby's.
And you're going to have something like another 12,000.
Yeah, Libby, you're freezing.
People there.
You're
And there's
I
no
think we got that.
doctor.
Okay, right, Pete. So
You can't get.
I'll hold. Yeah.
Okay.
Ask me. Yeah.
Right, Libby, you're beginning to freeze up. So let's let Peter answer the question as it stands so far. Thank you, Peter.
Yeah. So the next conversation that we're going to have at the Local Development Plan Advisory Committee, if you like, the next big kind of conversation that I want to involve a lot of people and with interesting views is about infrastructure and about how you plan for infrastructure. You know, the way that we do that via the planning system is to take what we call Section 106 agreements, and we've already announced that we're going to look at introducing a SIL regime in addition to the 106 agreement, because it allows us to do things in a different way that SIL didn't allow us to do when community infrastructure levy was first introduced. We can plan, we can master plan, and we can put policies in the local plan, but unless people bring them forward, we can't deliver them. What we do have a control over as a local authority is schools, right? Because we principally do most schools. The government changed that when they effectively didn't allow local authorities to build new schools and instead made the priority for free schools, right? So that was a bit of a hiccup. But we have a responsibility for planning for schools growth. And we've largely actually kept up to date with meeting both primary and secondary school demands. And in actual fact, there have been some circumstances where we've planned for increased class sizes and earmarked land and development where it's not been needed, because the school age population does tend to fluctuate. We've just gone through a bulge kind of year, or a bulge number of years, if like working the way through primary and secondary education. The bit that we don't control is primary care, right? Doctor surgeries, GPs practices. And whilst we can take money from developers through Section 106 agreements, and we can make it available to the NHS, the way that doctor surgeries, this is and Aaron Bevan famously said, he stuffed the mouth of GPs with gold in order to get them to agree to the National Health Service. GPs are independent practitioners of the NHS. And actually the profile of GPs in a place like Ealing is that they are getting disproportionately older, and GP partners are not coming in to replace them. And we actually have a very, very high number of independent single-handed GP practices. Now, in order to better plan for primary care and GP surgeries, we need the NHS commissioning group, or the board, to have a much, much clearer plan about what primary care in the 21st century looks like. We went through a process of talking about polyclinics and building buildings and putting services in them. That didn't necessarily go down very, very well. But we require a healthy conversation with the NHS to be able to make that kind of thing happen.
Right. The next, going straight into the next question, actually, it's about community infrastructure levy. And Sue New, are you able to speak? Can you unmute yourself? Yes, Sue, still. No, I think you've remuted yourself. Can you unmute yourself? Yeah, speak. Great, you're on.
Well, basically, Peter talked about some of that to do.
Breaking up a little bit.
Can you hear me?
You're breaking up a little bit.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me now?
It's a bit better.
Actually, may I read the question out for you? If you mute yourself, I'll read the question, because we can't. Okay, right. So Peter, what Sue was going to say, and indeed might even have been saying, is why is Ealing still the only London borough not to adopt community infrastructure levy despite the inspector's report of 2016? She asks. Other councils publish S106 and SIL contribution money every year to show the community where the money's been spent. Why not Ealing? She asks.
So there's a really good reason, right? There's a really good reason why we didn't implement community infrastructure levy, is because we didn't think that it would get us done what we needed to get done. So from a developer, when they're asked to make contributions to what they call the externalities of any development they bring forward, like basically doesn't really care where the money goes. They have to discount it from their developments because they know that it's going to be used on stuff that they would far rather they didn't, because it doesn't get them the profit rates that they want. Yeah. So whether we take that in the form of legally binding agreements, Section 106 agreements, that enable us to negotiate with them on things like their contributions to affordable housing, or if we take it in the form of a community infrastructure levy, which is effectively a fixed rate that's charged against the square footage, the square meterage of any particular development that brings forward, it produces the same outcome. But with a 106 agreement, we are able to bind developers into being able to do non-monetary things. And so, for example, affordable housing. You know, the priority of the political administration of the borough is to deliver genuinely affordable housing, 1/3 of average incomes. That's how we define it. And we're better able to do that when 95% of the developers who develop buildings in this borough are private developers. And so we have to be able to get from them higher levels of genuine affordable housing. If we just took the money and tried to deliver it ourselves, we wouldn't deliver the volume that we can do by using Section 106 agreements. Right. All of that being said, the SIL regime is now different, right? And what we will be doing in the next year is coming forward with proposals to implement a SIL regime. And there will be lots of conversations that we have within communities about what the infrastructure priorities should be. And every Severn town will have a plan that we will engage residents with to talk about what those types of externalities, what those projects and things that we should be spending our infrastructure money on should be.
And it will be clear where that money is going, or where the developer commitment to building stuff for the community is going.
Absolutely. One of the first things I did as a cabinet member for planning was say that we should be publishing our viability statements, right, and making sure that all of those financial transactions and those deals were published within the paperwork that people get to see on planning portals. Transparency is important to give people confidence that they are getting the best possible deal, but it's ultimately a deal.
Okay, let's moving towards the injury time and the final whistle. Let's talk about open space. Carolyn Brown, are you available to talk about open space or raise issues about open space? You need to. Yes, I think you're on. Yes.
Yeah? Okay.
Receiving you.
15% of Ealing is designated metropolitan open land, and this is largely the home to the borough's vital biodiversity. Obviously, gardens, etc., also offer a lot there. Given the pressures on land in Ealing, there will be few opportunities to create large areas of new public open space or natural habitats. Therefore, are the council going to protect the Brent River Park in its entirety and give it the highest protection in the new local plan so it can be enhanced, enjoyed by future generations? And also bearing in mind that Ealing Council has declared a climate emergency, will Ealing ensure that there is a firm protective stance on all metropolitan open land and community open space in the borough in the new local plan?
Yeah. So key question, right? And it begs a series of questions, not just in terms of the designation of land, but the use of land. There are plenty of parts of this borough that are considered to be metropolitan open land that are far from open. We have golf courses, shooting ranges, and horse riding clubs that people don't have access to. One of the big agendas that the Canal and Riverside Trust have talked about in their own plans is the fact that so much of our canal infrastructure, that used to be industrial and used to carry boats full of coal and goods that were very industrial in character, now are largely secluded and inaccessible to communities. And therefore their big agenda is how you get better connection for communities to canals, how you improve footpaths, how you improve the land that they have available to them. And that's the type of conversation, I think, and we'll have the conversation with residents, that we should be having about our metropolitan open land. You know, one of the consequences of COVID is that people, and there are rights of way across them, but people took to our municipal golf courses to enjoy them as parks. You know, we in some circumstances with some golf courses are subsidising their use as golf courses. Not saying we're going to change that, right? But would we rather use a big piece of green space along the Brent Valley corridor as a golf course, or do we want to do what Lewisham have done, for example, and turn a major golf course into an open park in which people can enjoy, and we can maximise the amount of green space? Equally, there are some bits of metropolitan open land that are toilet blocks and are car parks and that are grubby and disconnected and don't have biodiversity because they are effectively inaccessible, wasted bits of land that are not managed. Every bit of green space in a city like London is a managed bit of land, whether that's our canal and riverside banks that have our teams go in and pollard trees and dig up weeds and clear out detritus. We have to have a better way of managing it. Are we going to continue to offer protection to metropolitan open land? Absolutely. Do we want to? Absolutely. Do we have to combat the climate crisis by improving biodiversity? Yes, absolutely. Can we also talk about giving people greater access to green space? Absolutely. Have a look at the design guide. Have a look at the characterization study that we published a week ago that we discussed at the committee yesterday. And again, you'll see some really interesting statistics and some heat maps in terms of people's accessibility to green and open space. And that is something that is a priority for us to keep on doing going forward.
Excellent. Good news to hear that you're proposing to commit to expand biodiversity and look after it there.
Right, absolutely. Absolutely. We're not going to tackle the climate crisis unless we're able to have, and again, not just about green and open space. Look, we've had arguments in the last few weeks about low traffic neighbourhoods and about getting cars off the streets and making sure that we make space for cycling and walking. We're going to have some of those conversations in the local plan too.
That's nothing to do with biodiversity. This is a real concern for improving biodiversity and doing the best with what we've actually got and protecting it. And that's not been the case in the past.
But you think it sounds as if it might be more of the case in the future. I
absolutely.
Think.
If you put it into the local plan, it will be terrific.
Right, so there's something for the local plan.
Definitely. Biodiversity.
Right.
Zero energy. Right, carbon reduction. It'll be there.
Right. Okay. We've got three more on the list of submitted questions, and we're a few minutes over, but let's keep going. So Christine Eberol, are you with us? Are you able to speak? Christine Eberol, who's...
Yes, hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Go ahead, yeah.
Good. Okay. Yes, well, it's about front gardens. Gardens have already been mentioned, as has permitted development. At present, so my question in a nutshell is, can we use the local development plan to stop the endless paving over of front gardens in the borough? At present, when Ealing Council approves a pavement crossover, and this is under permitted development, which has existed for 25 years, to allow parking in a front garden, the front garden nearly always gets totally paved over. And we proved this by doing some research in 2017 with recently approved crossovers. Paving over front gardens in this way causes a lot of problems, both to the environment and to people. And many householders who do it don't actually like doing it, but they can't see a solution. And despite what you just said about roads and cycling and walking, there is going to be increasing pressure for car parking for many reasons, but two particularly evident ones are first that, the permitted development extension that you already mentioned, Councillor Mason, about houses increasing 2 stories, so that means more occupants and that means more vehicles. And the other one is electric vehicles. the government will give you a grant for a charging space, but the vehicles, which can be two, have to be off-road, and that means, in many cases, the front garden.
Okay, so
There is an alternative. Pardon?
Sorry, I was because I'm conscious of the time.
Sorry, yes. So just quickly, there is an alternative. Front gardens can be green. We've demonstrated it with the Royal Horticultural Society. Can this be put in the local development plan so that a condition of approving a crossover is that the front garden only has a maximum of 20% hard surfacing and the rest is green?
Right.
Yeah.
Sorry to be long.
I don't know whether it's because we were both on.
Right. Peter.
Yeah, so we have the ability to do that in some circumstances. So, for example, in conservation areas that have Article 4 directions, we have a better way of being able to ask people not to concrete over their gardens, their front gardens. But as you have already identified, permitted development rights do not allow us to do that as a blanket. And it becomes a very, very difficult process for us to do. You know, on biodiversity is the future sustainable SUDs, you know, sustainable urban drainage systems. You know, absolutely. Is it retaining front gardens and asking people not to concrete them over? Absolutely. But that's, in terms of our powers, it's much more of a cajoling and a persuading argument than it's going to be our ability to prevent it. You know, one of the difficult conversations about parking. When most of the Victorian infrastructure and the buildings that were built in most of the borough arrived, people weren't driving cars. Right, cars are a modern addition to our roads in a way that they never have been for the vast majority of development. So, you know, we need to get people out of their cars onto alternative forms of transport, whether it's public transport. That's not possible in lots of parts of the borough. But it is in parts that are connected to public transport, and you know, whether that's electric, whether that's other forms of vehicles, other forms of movement, then that's what we need to do. But we've got powers.
Okay, great.
Not all the ones that we
so
want.
how did that sound to you in a nutshell, in a small nutshell?
Heard it all before 1,000 times. So are you saying that the local development plan cannot be used to in any way discourage or restrict hard surfacing of front gardens?
What we can do in our characterisation studies and in our design guidance is ask people and give people a proactive suggestion to not pave over their gardens, to increase biodiversity by using gardens for gardens. Do we have the ability to say to a householder, you can't pave over your front garden? Unless they're in a conservation area that has an Article 4 direction, we can't do it. It's not a process that's possible.
Okay, thanks. Just a few more points. I think we've got a question from Mr. Will French, if he's able to unmute himself. Yes.
Yes. Thank you. I'm actually moving on now. I think we've come to the end of the broad topics that have been listed before. And I was just trying to pull it together at the end. It's been a really fascinating evening. Heard lots of things about the borough. But I hope, Peter, if anything, heard tonight how strongly people feel about their borough and how attached they are to it. And really understand that over the past few years, there's been huge frustration that people have felt they've been shut off and shut away from the changes that they've seen taking place here. And I think it's been really great that you've come along here and heard some of those points. They're only scratching the surface. We've had lots more questions we couldn't ask. So my question is, how can people become engaged in the process as it goes along? The local plan review is in progress now. There's been lots of expert views coming in, and people do want to have a say in it. And it's very hard to start off with to find out even what's happening, because the website you've got is absolutely totally useless, frankly. People want to get engaged. So please, can you tell us how you're going to take this forward? How are you going to take conversations like this and feed them into the plan-making process, and how people then can feel their voice is being heard?
Definitely. So it's going to take multiple phases, and partly what's called the local development scheme it sets the timetable for some of this activity. And what we're trying to do, and what I'm trying to do before we even get to the point at which we give the public a draft plan for Ealing that says what we're going to do, is to have some of these formative conversations. So it's conversations like this that you host yourselves that we will commit to coming to and having discussions. It's the kinds of conversations that we're trying to have through the local development advisory panel by bringing people together, including critical voices who, you know, can be friendly, who can be critical friends, but also can be quite critical and have and elevate the conversation to talk about some of those bigger issues and trends. What we're also going to be looking to do in the coming months is to take that type of big conversation out to the 7 town areas. So to Southall, to Hanwell, to Ealing, Acton, Northolt, Perivale and Greenford, and replicate those place-based conversations. We're going to do it in terms of your priorities for community infrastructure levies and the money that we spend on investment in infrastructure for local communities, but we're also going to do it just in terms of kicking the tires with communities about whether our interpretation, our professional interpretation of what we think the character of local neighbourhoods are. And we're going to do it again when we start thinking about the interventions and the design guides that are going to sit as part of the eventual local plan. We will then go in the future to a formal consultation in which people will be able to make direct representations, and just like a planning process, and I know people are sceptical about them, you will have the ability to make representations and we will have to respond. This is not a quick conversation. This is not something that we're going to do in 6 months and it's done and dusted. This is a multi-year program where we're going to keep on having these conversations, and I'm certainly committing to Ealing Matters and to the Ealing Civic Society and those who wanted to be involved in that conversation. We'll have an open door, and that we can do that together.
I can't type. Look, everything I do, it comes up with that little white line. What does that mean?
It means that you're speaking, madam. Right, Will, any response to what Peter said? We're in a process here. We hope it's going to lead to further.
Very briefly, because I know time is running out, but you know, if this happens, I will say it's going to be a real shift in approach, I think, from the council, and I think that would be absolutely terrific if it does happen. At the moment, I think everyone is watching with interest to see how it will happen, because we do want to be engaged. And really, if you give us a chance to, I'm sure we will be engaged in a positive and constructive way.
Right. Look, there are going to be disagreements, right? Because as I said right at the beginning, different people come to this table with different priorities and different sets of values about what government should or shouldn't do and about what people's priorities are or they are not. We are going to have disagreements along the way. My commitment is that we can have those disagreements and we can make compromises in a way in which we give you information, we engage you in that conversation, we understand the challenges, and that we might not get 100% of what we want, but we can get to the position in which most people get most of what they want. It's going to be difficult, it's going to be challenging, but we will stay committed to it, and I hope others will stay committed to it too.
Right. Libby Kemp, I think, has got one kind of final point to raise. Libby, are you ready?
Yeah, I'm ready. Can you hear me?
Yes, indeed. Go ahead, please.
Right. I think everybody's wondering why Bromley can get away with no towers and low development, and as of some other boroughs, and we can't. It's not that we're against development. We seriously need social housing. We seriously need family homes. We don't need homes for overseas developers. And Bromley can get away with it. Now, I am a lifetime Labour voter, but quite honestly, Bromley is a Conservative council. And if you carry on like this, an awful lot of your lifetime Labour voters are going to be voting for something else. You're not doing yourselves any favours at all.
Right. So why can't we be more like Bromley, Peter?
Look, it's, Bromley's a very different borough. It's different political complexion. It's different character. It's further out in south. It's in where are we? East London. It's Kent. There are large swathes of it that are rural in nature. It's not underneath the Heathrow flight path. It doesn't have substantial amounts of tube connections. Its land value is significantly lower. And people don't look to Bromley to commute from in the way that they do to Ealing. And it doesn't have some of the benefits that we do. Bromley does what Bromley wants to do, and it deals in the same kind of framework and the environment that it deals with. As I say, we have to deal with the world as it is, not how we wish it to be, but we work to try and make that happen.
I think maybe we should start wishing to be, because we really do want homes for our families. We don't want homes to be sold overseas. We don't want these tower blocks with 2 bedrooms where people are stuck. It's just not on. And you're not doing yourself any favour. You're absolutely shedding Labour voters.
Okay, I'd like to wrap up there, but with just one final question from me, Peter, looking at something that somebody else has sent in. I hope you feel this has been really useful. I hope the more than 90 people that have participated have found it useful. But it won't be just another tick box exercise for London Borough of Ealing. We don't want to be ticked, I hope you found it useful, and I hope that there will be other discussions like this, because there's been a sad shortage of them over the past few years, and I don't need to repeat that. Other people have already said that. So I'd like to thank you for your time. This is the umpteenth evening this week. I think you've been doing this kind of thing. Thank you very much. Thank you for the people who organised this, in particular Will, Kay and Libby, and whoever else I don't know about. I was just asked to be some sort of a front man. Thank you for the opportunity to do this. It's been really interesting. It's 9:02. Thank you very much indeed, and good night.
Thank you. Thanks very much for having me.
Thank you.
Well done, Libby, Kay and team.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
Right. I'll just stop the recording, and tomorrow you can watch it all again.